One morning in the spring of 1999, gunshots rang out in a tiny village in Malaysia. Once they stopped, a shopkeeper slowly opened his door to see what was going on. He watched in confusion as a convoy of military vehicles rolled down the street, filled with soldiers carrying rifles slung across their backs. Then the soldiers stopped in front of a farm just down the road. The owner of that farm came outside and met the soldiers at the door, and then, very solemnly, this farm owner walked the soldiers around to the back of the property, where there was this big thicket of fruit trees. The shopkeeper, who was watching this from a distance, was so curious as to what they were doing behind this farm that the shopkeeper stepped out onto the road, and suddenly he had a clear view of behind this farm. And what he saw was these soldiers taking up positions, raising their rifles, and shooting at something just below these fruit trees. And after the gunfire stopped, the shopkeeper began hearing all these terrible squeals and screams, and then the air began to smell like blood. Terrified, the shopkeeper turned around and ran back inside his shop, hoping that whatever was going on here would be over soon. However, the shopkeeper would be terribly wrong. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you enjoy today's story, be sure to train your cat to chew on electrical cords, and then release the cat into the follow button's house. Today's story is called Village of Death. On a hot fall morning in 1998, a 57-year-old cabinet maker named Kiam Beng stood outside of his shop in a rural Malaysian village, waiting for a friend to pick up an order. Kiam Beng swatted away mosquitoes and looked down the road. His friend, Ash, was an hour late. He had promised to be there when the shop opened, but there was still no sign of him. In front of his workshop, Kiam Beng could see an orchard that grew durian, which is a popular fruit in Southeast Asia. Next to the orchard, another farm raised hundreds of pigs. Their familiar grunting echoed through the dense canopy of trees. Nearly everyone in town made a living as farmers, and Kiam Beng could smell the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil and manure in the humid air. Kiam Beng eyed the empty road again and turned back to his shop. He didn't have a phone, otherwise he would have called to see where Ash was. But until Ash showed up, Kiam Beng was content to go back to his work while his dogs ran in and out of the workshop. But as the hours ticked by, Kiam Beng started to think that his friend might not come to pick up his cabinets at all. Finally, as Kiam Beng prepared to close up at the end of the day, a messenger arrived with a note from Ash. He had a headache and he was vomiting, so he wasn't able to go anywhere. Kiam Beng thanked the messenger and then finished closing up his shop, and then started walking home with his dogs. The sun was setting over the lush green valley, and he could just barely see bats fluttering in the durian trees. Kiam Beng was worried about his sick friend. The symptoms he listed were painfully familiar. There was a serious illness going around this town that the local doctors called Japanese encephalitis. Other people had become so sick that they couldn't move or speak, and still others had seizures and went into comas. Kiam Beng prayed that Ash wouldn't be one of the unlucky ones. As Kiam Beng kept walking down the road, he saw a giant truck slowly drive by that was billowing white fog into the air behind it. Kiam Beng had read that the Malaysian government was spraying the area to kill mosquitoes, which was how Japanese encephalitis was spread. The sight of the truck made Kiam Beng feel a little more at ease. Once the mosquitoes were gone, the disease would go away too. The next day, Kiam Beng spent the morning painting cabinets and playing fetch with his two dogs. Later in the afternoon, he heard a car rumbling down the road, and he looked up hopefully. The road wasn't usually very busy, and he'd checked every car that passed to see if it was Ash. But as this car got closer, he could see that it was the same messenger from the day before. The messenger pulled up and then got out of the car and walked up to Kiam Beng's shop. His expression was grim as he handed Kiam Beng the paper with the message. This time, it was written by Ash's wife. Bing's heart sank as he read. Ash had been taken to the hospital, but he was too sick, and the doctors there couldn't help him. He had died from this Japanese encephalitis. Bing felt a sense of dread. He'd known how dangerous the disease was, but now that his friend was dead, it felt much more real. He hurried back to his shop and called his dogs inside. Then he closed the door. Bing realized that he hadn't been taking the disease seriously enough. Now he was determined to do whatever was necessary to avoid being bit by a mosquito, even if that meant staying inside basically all the time and shutting down his business for a while. The government was spraying pesticides to kill all the mosquitoes, but Bing knew the insects would not disappear completely. Several months later, on February 27, 1999, a young scientist named Ka-Bing Chua steadied his hands as he swabbed a viral culture onto a petri dish. Dr. Chua was studying virology at the University of Malaya Medical Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's largest city. Dr. Chua was investigating the outbreak of a disease that the government had been calling Japanese encephalitis. Roughly 200 people in Malaysia had gotten sick so far, and close to 100 had been admitted to Dr. Chua's hospital. Most of them exhibited the same symptoms: swelling of the brain, which led to an inability to talk or walk. Many of the patients became fully paralyzed or fell into comas. The fatality rate was staggering. 2 out of every 5 people who became infected died, making the outbreak almost as lethal as the bubonic plague, which wiped out a third of Europe's entire population during the Middle Ages. Dr. Chua's university had conducted a variety of tests to confirm that all the sick patients were positive for Japanese encephalitis. However, the results of these tests were inconclusive. There were at least a few researchers who felt they couldn't be exactly sure what was making all these people sick. However, the symptoms were highly similar to Japanese encephalitis, and there were no other known diseases in the area that could explain the outbreak. But Dr. Chua was uncomfortable settling on this sort of uncertain evidence. He had a nagging feeling that there was something else going on. Dr. Chua was also getting mounting pressure from his lab director to come up with better answers soon. Right now, the government was investing all its efforts in killing mosquitoes. But what if this outbreak wasn't being spread by mosquitoes after all? One of Dr. Chua's colleagues, who had been studying the question of which people were most likely to get sick, had pointed out an interesting fact. No Muslims had been infected with this virus, even though Islam is Malaysia's leading religion. This was strange because Japanese encephalitis is transmitted through mosquito bites, and there was no reason why people of a particular religion would be immune to mosquitoes. This made Dr. Chua even more skeptical that the patients they were studying had Japanese encephalitis. So he decided to run his own tests. He was going to isolate the disease right there in his lab so he could get a better look at it. Dr. Chua hand-selected cerebrospinal fluid and serum samples from patients whose symptoms most closely resembled Japanese encephalitis. Then he put each one in a sealed dish and tucked it into an incubator that warmed it to the temperature of a human body, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Then Chua waited. He hoped that the warmed-up fluid samples would create the perfect environment for the disease to show itself. If successful, Dr. Chua would eventually be able to cultivate highly concentrated and highly lethal dishes full of the disease that he could study. Nearly 1 week later, Dr. Chua pulled the cultures from the incubator. While the samples had been incubating, 5 more patients had been admitted to a nearby hospital with the same deadly symptoms. Their fluid samples were sent to Dr. Chua's department. Dr. Chua knew that every second counted. If this disease was not Japanese encephalitis, and Dr. Chua was able to identify what it really was, then doctors might be able to find a cure and save everyone who was already sick. Dr. Chua slid the samples under his microscope and then stooped down to look through the eyepiece. His experiment with the incubator had worked. The dish was jammed full of invading microbes. But when this virus was exposed to animal cells, the nature of its deadly effect was unexpected. Dr. Chua wasn't sure what he was looking at, but it definitely was not Japanese encephalitis. Dr. Chua knew he needed to show his boss, who was the head of the department at the university, right away. and so Dr. Chua sprinted out the door to find him. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chua's boss was examining the same culture under the microscope. Dr. Chua stood nearby, his stomach churning with anxiety. He knew his finding was significant, and they could save lives if they acted fast. But after a long moment, Dr. Chua's boss finally stood and just shook his head. He interpreted the results differently and didn't see enough evidence to prove that the virus was new. He argued that the virus's strange behavior could be due to normal variations in the culture, or even that the culture could be contaminated. He still believed that the results were consistent with this being Japanese encephalitis. He told Dr. Chua to throw the sample away. Dr. Chua was shocked. He knew that his experiment was not contaminated, but he also knew better than to outright challenge his superior. However, Dr. Chua knew he could not back down completely. There was too much at stake. He just needed to find the right moment to convince his boss. 4 days later, on March 9th, Dr. Chua got his chance. He was driving with his boss and 2 other colleagues returning from a meeting. The rain was coming down in sheets, and their car was inching forward in heavy traffic. It gave Dr. Chua a captive audience. Dr. Chua glanced at the men and then leaned forward in his seat, making sure he had his boss's attention. Dr. Chua cleared his throat and then quickly launched into his theory. He emphasized the virus's unique effect on animal cells and said the variation was enough to prove that they were dealing with something unknown. The disease they were fighting was caused by an entirely new virus, he said, and they needed to take action immediately. The sickness had already spread to several other Malaysian states and hopped the border into Singapore. As Dr. Chua described his findings, his colleagues' expressions showed signs of concern, but Dr. Chua's boss remained neutral. He pressed on, explaining that while he was sure they had discovered a new virus, their lab's equipment was not yet powerful enough to identify it. He argued that they really needed to send the cultures to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. The CDC had the right equipment, and it was in their best interest to help. This wasn't simply an outbreak affecting people in Malaysia. It had the potential to become a global pandemic with devastating consequences if they didn't control it quickly. The air in the car was thick with tension as Dr. Chua waited for his boss to react. Finally, his boss cleared his throat and spoke. Dr. Chua's theory had merit, he said, and he would think about it overnight. Then the car they were in pulled up to Dr. Chua's boss's home, and his boss climbed out and walked away in the pouring rain. The next morning, Dr. Chua woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. It was his boss. He told Dr. Chua that he'd made some calls and a travel visa was being expedited for Dr. Chua to get to the United States. Dr. Chua was so relieved, and he thanked his boss, and then he rushed to the hospital to prepare the virus samples for a trip to America. Four days later, Dr. Chua stood in the CDC's research lab in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. Chua peered through a powerful electron microscope at his slides. This awesome device was literally thousands of times better than anything Dr. Chua was using at magnifying samples, giving Chua a much more intimate look at his adversary. Underneath the lens of the microscope, his virus cultures revealed tiny ring-like formations covering the slide. He blinked and looked again to make sure. Now, Dr. Chua knew for certain that the scientists in Malaysia had misidentified the virus. But Dr. Chua did not feel excitement or pride that he had been right. Instead, at that moment, he felt terror. The type of virus on that slide was far deadlier than Japanese encephalitis, and it wasn't spread by mosquitoes. But, based on the virus's unique characteristics, Dr. Chua was almost positive he knew what was spreading it. He needed to report his findings immediately. Dr. Chua flagged down one of the CDC's scientists and asked for the nearest telephone. After he finished his call to his boss in Malaysia, he showed his discovery to CDC officials. They were instantly alarmed and agreed with Dr. Chua's assessment. The outbreak in Malaysia had the potential to kill millions of people. Back in Malaysia, a few days after Dr. Chua's discovery, the 57-year-old cabinet maker, Kiam Bing, watched from the doorway of his workshop as soldiers put up barricades at the end of the main road in his town. Bing was staying inside as much as possible to avoid the mosquitoes that he believed were carrying this virus. The only time he went outside was to run between his home and his shop. By now, it seemed like almost every family in town had lost a loved one to this terrible disease. They'd all died painful and horrifying deaths, and residents were in a panic. The disease was showing no signs of slowing down either, and so the government was barricading the road into town to keep residents there quarantined. Bing had lived here his entire life, and he couldn't remember any other time when travel in or out of the area had been restricted. The road was usually bustling with people going to and from work at this time of the day, but now it was deserted. The only sound was the fluttering of these red banners that people hung outside of their houses to ward off death. The silence frightened Bing. Even his dogs seemed different. Instead of jumping around and playing with their ball, they curled up quietly on the floor. And then, as Bing was watching all this strangeness unfold in front of him, Bing began to hear the sound of gunshots. When Bing heard these gunshots, he instinctively hid behind his counter. Once it stopped, Bing stood up and slowly opened his front door to see what was going on outside. And what he saw was a group of soldiers with rifles slung across their backs, marching out from behind a farm down the road and heading towards the next one. Also, there were all these military vehicles full of dozens more soldiers that were driving down the road, and they were all heading for different farms. Bing watched as some of the soldiers stopped in front of the farm right across the street, and they went around to the back of the property. Bing stepped out of his store to get a better look, and he peered around the corner of the farm across the street, and he could see the soldiers now pointing their rifles towards the trees, and also the pig pens below the trees. Bing knew what was coming next, and he couldn't bear to watch it. He ran back to the doorway of his shop, and then a few moments later, he heard more gunfire and the terrible sound of pigs squealing in agony. Bing could literally smell the coppery stench of blood as it wafted through the thick, hot air. And then moments later, the soldiers emerged from behind the farm and began marching down the street towards the next farm. And the farm's owner from across the street followed the soldiers out onto the road, and the owner just sat down on the sidewalk and put his face in his hands. Once the soldiers had marched down the road and were gone, Bing hustled across the street and knelt down next to the farmer who still had his face in his hands. After making sure this farmer was okay, Bing gently asked, what happened? What's going on? And the farmer just shook his head in disbelief, and in a shaky voice, he told Bing that the government had issued an order for all the pigs in this village to be slaughtered and buried. They told him that this would stop the terrible disease that had been killing people for months. Bing was shocked. He remembered that the government had sprayed the town for the mosquitoes to stop the disease. Now they were saying it came from the pigs? Bing returned to his shop and closed the door. He smiled at his dogs, who hadn't moved since he left. Bing felt badly for his neighbors, but at the same time, he was grateful that the mystery of this disease seemed to be solved, and that now Bing really was safe. It was nearly impossible to avoid all mosquitoes like Bing had been trying to do, but he had no reason to interact with pigs, which apparently were the reason this disease was spreading, and so Bing really felt like he was going to be okay. 2 days later, Bing woke up feeling feverish. His head was pounding and he couldn't pull himself from the bed. His skin felt like it was on fire. In a panic, he realized that he must be sick with this mysterious disease. Bing didn't understand how this was happening to him. He hadn't gone near any pigs. But Bing didn't have time to worry about that. He needed to get to a hospital. He managed to drag himself out of bed and stumbled over to a neighbor's house where he knew there was a phone. He begged the neighbor to please call him an ambulance, and then Bing collapsed to the ground. A few minutes later, the paramedics arrived and took Bing to the nearest major hospital, which was about 50 miles to the north, at the University Hospital in Kuala Lumpur. The intake nurse in the emergency room asked Bing to describe his symptoms and when they started, and Bing, who had been strapped to a gurney for the entire ambulance ride, felt his voice stick in his throat. To his horror, he couldn't respond. He tried to swallow, but it was no use. He was totally paralyzed. Qianbing could see the nurse's eyes widen in alarm. He watched, terrified, as the nurses wheeled him through the hospital, helpless as he felt his body lock around him. It didn't take long to confirm that Qianbing's sickness was indeed the same virus that Dr. Chua had identified in Colorado at the CDC research lab. But that knowledge didn't help Qianbing's doctors. Shortly after he was admitted, Qianbing fell into a vegetative state and then died. In early June of 1999, around 3 months after Qianbing died, Dr. Chua was back at his office in Kuala Lumpur. It seemed like the mystery virus had been defeated, all thanks to Dr. Chua's quick thinking. But Dr. Chua wasn't sure if the mystery really was completely solved. The virus he had identified at the CDC's lab was called a paramyxovirus. This virus is transmitted from livestock animals to people, and many of the patients who had caught it worked with pigs. It wasn't affecting Muslims because they didn't eat pork. But many people in the country did eat pork, so Dr. Chua and a team of experts had advised the Malaysian authorities that if they wanted to stop the disease, they would have to make the difficult decision to kill as many pigs as possible in the affected areas. The government reacted quickly and sent squads of soldiers to eliminate over 1 million pigs. And after they did that, sure enough, cases of this mysterious disease started to dwindle. When it came to naming the virus, officials looked to the small pig farming town it had originated in and where Qianbing, the cabinet maker, was from, Nipah. They would call it the Nipah virus. But something kept bothering Dr. Chua. Most of the Nipah virus victims were farmers who had direct contact with infected pigs, which made sense. But nearly 20% of the patients had minimal or no contact with the animals, but they still got this disease. Qianbing, the cabinet maker, was one of those unlucky 20%. Dr. Chua knew that Qianbing must have caught this disease somewhere, and if it wasn't from pigs, then where did he get it from? Could it be that another animal was spreading the Nipah virus in addition to the pigs? Chua started to wonder if pigs really were the source of the virus or if they were just a carrier. Maybe, he thought, the true source of the virus was another creature altogether. And so now that the outbreak was under control following the elimination of all these pigs, the Malaysian government deployed a team of researchers to try to determine the true source of the Nipah virus. As the scientists investigated, they found that the Nipah virus was closely related to another virus that had caused a small outbreak in Australia a few years earlier. At the time, researchers had been able to identify the source of the outbreak. It was fruit bats. So now, Malaysian researchers quickly zeroed in on an extraordinary type of bat called the flying fox, which lived near the village of Nipah and throughout the country. These animals, among the largest bats in the world, can have wingspans of up to 5 feet, but they're not normally harmful to humans. They mostly mind their own business, feeding on fruit trees like durian, which was one of the primary crops grown in Nipah. But when researchers captured some flying foxes for study, they found that a large number of them tested positive for Nipah virus. The virus did not seem to harm the animals at all, but the researchers suddenly realized that the bats themselves were doing enormous harm to the people all around them. The bats, not the pigs and not the mosquitoes, were the real source of this terrible disease. Here's how it worked. The bats came out at night to feed on the durian flowers, and as they did that, their droppings and urine would fall to the ground below them. When morning came, the pigs were let out of their pens, and they came into contact with the bat droppings and the bat urine that was contaminated with the Nipah virus. And so did other animals, like horses and dogs, and in turn, these animals passed it on to their owners. That's how people who did not work with pigs became infected, and that's how Qianbing, the cabinet maker, got the virus. At some point, his dogs must have sniffed around some durian trees and come into contact with infected droppings, and then when Qianbing went to play with them and the dogs licked his face, they passed the virus on to him. In the past, there had never been a Nipah virus outbreak because fruit trees like durian and the bats were far from any industrial animal farms. But as farming expanded in Malaysia, fruit orchards were planted right next to pig farms and other commercial areas, which allowed the disease to spread. The discovery that fruit bats were the real spreader of the virus allowed the researchers to truly understand how the Nipah virus operated. But it also meant that future outbreaks would be impossible to stop. The fruit bats responsible for the Nipah virus live throughout Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. There's no way to effectively control their population or to stop them from eating fruit from commercial farms. So the only way to truly stop the Nipah virus is to create a vaccine for it. But scientists haven't figured out how to make one yet. In recent years, there have been more outbreaks around the world, striking fear into scientists and public health officials. The World Health Organization has labeled this virus as being a virus with catastrophic global pandemic potential. If the virus ever becomes airborne, it could be transmitted through coughs, sneezes, or contaminated surfaces. If that happens, millions of lives will be at risk. And we might not be able to do anything about it. On the evening of October 28, 2012, 87-year-old Barbara Howe sat at the dinner table with a friend in her house at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village in the small town of Monroe, Ohio. As the two women began eating, Barbara's friend had a huge smile on her face. She couldn't get over how Barbara still loved to cook and how good she was at it. At 87 years old, Barbara made it a point to stay active, and she loved cooking and having people over to her house as often as she could. And when she wasn't entertaining, she loved to drive her prized red Cadillac around town and visit the shops on Main Street. At the dinner table, Barbara broke down the latest episode of Dancing with the Stars, which she watched religiously, and then also the two women caught each other up on what was going on with their kids and their grandkids. Barbara's husband had died about 14 years earlier, and since then she'd lived on her own. But her family, especially her daughters and her granddaughter Barbie, made sure she was never by herself too often. Just then, the landline phone rang, and Barbara shook her head. People calling during dinner time was so rude, as far as she was concerned. But she excused herself from the table and walked into the bedroom to grab it. The person on the phone said they were working in the retirement village that evening to fix and update all of the residents' Lifeline medical alert systems. Lifeline was a device that allowed someone to push a single button in order to get medical help in case of an emergency. Everyone who lived at Mount Pleasant had one, and it had a piece of equipment connected to the phone line that sometimes required maintenance. Barbara thanked the Lifeline worker for letting her know, said she'd see them soon, hung up, and went back to the table. Barbara and her friend talked and ate a while longer, and then finished up their dinner. They made plans to catch up again the following week, said goodnight, and then Barbara's friend headed out. Barbara cleared the table and started cleaning up the kitchen right away. She'd been a neat freak her entire life, and she couldn't stand having any kind of mess or clutter in her house. When she was finished cleaning, she poured herself a glass of iced tea, walked into the living room, and sat down in her favorite chair. She put her drink down on a small table right by her chair, then she grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. But just as she began flipping through the channels, she heard a knock at her front door. Two days later, on the morning of October 30th, Detective Greg Myers of the Monroe Police Department took a call at his desk. The woman on the phone quickly introduced herself as Donna Wesselman, and Detective Myers thought she sounded very frantic. Donna said she had plans to meet up with her mother, Barbara Howe, later that day, but she'd been trying all morning and she couldn't get a hold of her. And this was not normal. Her mom always answered her cell phone, or at least called back within a few minutes. Donna said she talked to family and her mother's closest friends, and nobody had heard from Barbara in over a day. And her mom was 87 years old, so she was really worried that she might have fallen down in the house, gotten hurt, and now couldn't call for help. Detective Myers got Barbara's address and told Donna to meet him there. He would do a wellness check on her mother and make sure everything was okay. After Myers hung up, he headed right out to his car. As a veteran detective in a small police department, he was used to handling all kinds of cases. The Monroe PD didn't have things like missing persons or homicide divisions, so the few detectives on the force had to jump in wherever they were needed, including wellness checks like this one. As Myers drove past the town's quiet Main Street, he looked at all the old-fashioned shops that were all decorated for Halloween, and he thought it looked like something out of a classic 1950s horror movie. A few minutes later, Myers arrived at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village, and he found Donna very anxiously waiting outside of her mother's house for him. After reassuring Donna that everything was okay, he'd go in there with her, Donna pulled out the key that she had to her mother's house, she walked up to the front door, and she opened it. The pair walked into Barbara's house, and immediately Donna called out to her mother, but there was no response. Now, at first glance, nothing looked out of place to Detective Myers. He didn't see any signs of forced entry or struggle, which made total sense, because he believed Barbara had most likely fallen or gotten hurt while she was alone at the house. Detective Myers and Donna quickly searched every room in the house, but there was no sign of Barbara anywhere. But when they came back into the TV room, Donna noticed a glass on a small table, and she pointed at it, and she had this frightened look on her face. Myers didn't understand. It was just a half-empty glass of what looked like iced tea. But Donna said her mother had to be one of the neatest people alive. She would never leave a half-empty glass on the table like that. Detective Myers glanced around the room. Other than the iced tea, he didn't see any other indications that Barbara had been home recently. So he asked Donna if her mother still drove, and she said yes, she did, all the time. Myers led Donna back outside, and as soon as she was out there, she suddenly realized something else was off. Her mother's prized red Cadillac was gone. Detective Myers quickly shifted his focus from the house to the missing car. He now worried that Barbara might have driven off the road, or maybe gotten into some kind of car accident. She could have been injured and trapped in the car somewhere for almost 2 days now. He told Donna to go home and wait for his call. In the meantime, he'd issue a BOLO, a be on the lookout call, for Barbara's red Cadillac. This would go to law enforcement departments all over the area. Myers got in his car and immediately called in the BOLO. He also reached out to the Ohio State Police, because he knew his department just did not have the resources to carry out a full-scale search for Barbara. And since she'd possibly been missing now for almost 48 hours, he needed all the help he could get, and he needed it fast. Two days later, on November 1st, Detective Myers sat at his desk, desperately hoping for some kind of lead on Barbara or her missing car. He'd stayed in regular contact with local, county, and state law enforcement agencies, all of whom were aiding in the search. But so far, nobody had found anything. He had also continued to update Barbara's daughter, Donna, about the whole situation, and he'd begun receiving regular phone calls from Barbara's granddaughter, Barbie, who was a young adult. In fact, Barbie had become kind of relentless, asking for regular updates and wanting specific details of the police search. Myers knew Barbara's family was upset and panicked, of course, and they had every right to want answers from the police. But right from the get-go, something about these calls from Barbie just seemed off to him. Still, at this point, he believed Barbara most likely had gotten into a car accident, so he didn't think too much about why her granddaughter was behaving strangely. After all, stress can make people act in all kinds of different ways. At around 1 p.m. that day, Myers' phone rang, and he finally got the news he'd been waiting for. A state police helicopter had conducted an overhead search, and they had located Barbara's red Cadillac. It was in the parking lot of an apartment complex in the town next to Monroe. Detective Myers contacted the local police from that town, and then rushed out to his car and drove over to that apartment complex. When Myers arrived, he saw local police officers already on site, waiting for him. And he also saw a man wearing a dark suit getting out of what was clearly an unmarked police car. Myers stepped outside, and the man in the suit came over to him. The man introduced himself as Agent Brian White of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and he said he was there to help. Detective Myers had been holding out hope that even if Barbara was hurt, he would still find her safe and relatively unharmed. But as he and Agent White walked towards the red car, they feared that that was not the situation. because as soon as they got near the car, they could smell something. It was the smell of bleach. And Myers knew that, almost always, bleach was an indication that somebody had tried to cover up a crime. And as they got closer to the car, they saw the trunk was not completely closed, and clearly the bleach smell was coming out of there. And then, once the two officers were standing right behind the trunk, sort of wincing from the bleach smell, they looked down and saw very clearly there were long strands of human hair sticking out of the trunk. At this point, Myers and White put on their gloves and opened up the trunk. And what they found inside was somehow even more horrifying than what they had expected. They had already expected the worst. There was a deceased woman laying in the trunk, and they immediately identified her as Barbara Howe. Barbara was almost completely naked, chunks of her hair had been cut off, and there was a strange gray dust covering her body. And her head barely remained attached to her neck. Police immediately began searching the Cadillac and the surrounding area. But the state forensics team needed more space, and they wanted to get the car and Barbara's body into a more controlled environment. None of these small-town police departments in the area had facilities to house a car for a full forensic search. So the local fire department cleared out space at their station and let the police move the car there. Once the forensics team had the time and space to really get to work, they told Myers and White that the killer had most likely poured bleach all over Barbara's body after she was dead. But the killer had not bleached the trunk or the car. And forensics techs said that after the killer covered Barbara's body in bleach, they had most likely emptied out a vacuum cleaner on her. That's where the techs thought that strange gray dust covering her body had come from. But most importantly, they said they had found some blood in the trunk and the car, but not nearly enough to match the brutal, deep wounds on Barbara's neck. They said if that kind of attack had been delivered in the trunk or the car, they would have found far more blood than they did. So, based on this, Detective Myers and Agent White believed the murder must have taken place somewhere else, and Barbara had been dumped in her own trunk and then driven to the apartment complex. The investigators thought that the most likely site of the murder would have to have been Barbara's house, but Myers had been there for that wellness check, and he hadn't seen any blood or anything that indicated a violent attack had taken place there. That said, Myers knew he could have overlooked something while he was there. There hadn't been a reported homicide in Monroe, Ohio in almost a decade. So when Myers had gone to Barbara's house, the thought that Barbara, an 87-year-old woman who lived in an upscale retirement village, had been brutally murdered there had not really even crossed his mind, so he wasn't really looking for indications of a murder. So, Myers and Agent White gathered up a group of Monroe police officers and Ohio State troopers and went back to Barbara's house to conduct a much more thorough, full-scale search. Later that evening, now almost 4 full days after anyone had seen Barbara alive, Myers, White, and their team walked through Barbara's house, and nothing new really stood out. There still didn't appear to be any signs of forced entry or of a struggle of any kind. Detective Myers also found jewelry boxes that were filled with what looked like really expensive rings and necklaces just laying out in the open in Barbara's bedroom. And it didn't look like anyone had touched Barbara's high-end TV or any of the other electronics in the house. So it definitely did not appear like someone had come to burglarize the house. And even though Barbara's daughter had talked about how clean her mom was, a glass of iced tea on a table was not enough to prove that something bad had happened there. So, Myers and White started to think that they would have to expand their search across Monroe and the nearby towns in order to find the location where Barbara had been killed. But as they were getting ready to pack up and leave Barbara's house, they both noticed something at the exact same time. The heater came on in the house, and they could feel the heat coming from the floor. This meant that there were pipes under the floor that were heating the house. And they knew there had to be a way for maintenance workers to get to those pipes if they needed repairs. So Agent White called out to the team on site and said they needed to search the house for any place that might provide access to the pipes under the floor. And within a couple of minutes, a state trooper shouted for White and Myers, and they rushed through the house, and they found him inside of a utility room just off the kitchen. The trooper pointed to the floor, and Myers and White looked at each other and then bent down, because they saw a wooden panel that almost completely blended in with the floor, and they realized this was actually the entrance to a crawl space. They lifted up the wooden panel and they looked inside. And right away, both men felt a mix of excitement and horror. There, in this tiny crawl space, they saw a rug that was covered in blood. And there was blood spatter all over the floor and the sides of this crawl space. Late that night, after forensics techs had collected blood and possible DNA samples from the rug, the crawl space, and throughout the house, Myers and White laid out a plan. They knew that a group of trained law enforcement officers, including both of them, had searched this house and almost left without finding the entrance to that crawl space. So they didn't believe that Barbara's killer was just some random person who just happened to stumble upon that hidden panel in the utility room floor. Instead, they were sure that her killer must have had intimate knowledge of the layout of the house. And for Myers and White, only a limited number of people could fit the bill. Staff members and maintenance crew who worked at the retirement village, and Barbara's close friends and family. Agent White had the resources at his disposal to track down and interview everyone on staff at Mount Pleasant. So Myers, who was well respected in the local community, would handle speaking to Barbara's friends and family. And Detective Myers knew who he wanted to start with, because he lived by a simple adage when it came to police work. If there's a fire, and someone watching that fire burn wants to know all the details about how it started and how it spread, there's a good chance that person may have started the fire. And Myers thought the same went for violent crimes. And there was one person who had wanted all the details about Barbara's disappearance and the police investigation from the very beginning: her own granddaughter, Barbie. In the days following the discovery of that crawl space, Detective Myers and his team dug deeper into Barbara's life and her relationship with her granddaughter. And what they found did not really surprise them. Barbara was loved by pretty much everyone who knew her. She was smart, funny, and always looked out for other people. But hearing things like this was pretty common for police when talking to people who had just lost their loved one. But Myers got the sense that Barbara really was this kind person who had tried to take care of other people for most of her life. However, there was something else that Myers kept hearing about Barbara. She and her late husband had apparently always been great with money. So, over the years, Barbara had become extremely wealthy. And because of the type of person she was, she wanted to take care of everyone she loved after she was gone. Which meant her kids stood to inherit sizable portions of her wealth once she passed away. And also, so did her granddaughter, Barbie. And so, armed with this information, Detective Myers brought Barbie in for an interview at the police station. Barbie sat down across from Myers at his desk, and she proved to be as talkative as she'd been every time she'd called him about the investigation. Over the course of this conversation, Barbie communicated to Myers that she loved her grandmother. But she also communicated that she was having some money issues. She told him that she really had to work hard just to pay her rent and cover her bills. Now, on the surface, that did not seem particularly strange to Myers. Barbie came off like a lot of young people do who were living on their own for the first time. But there was also something that Myers could not quite figure out. Barbie still seemed like she wanted to know everything about the investigation, and Myers honestly couldn't tell if this was because of some morbid curiosity, if it was nerves, grief, or if she really was the arsonist watching the fire she had set. So, eventually, he told Barbie that the best way she could help the investigation would be to provide a DNA sample. And Barbie said yes, of course. And so Myers had an officer swab her cheek to get the sample, and then after that, he let her go. Part of Myers didn't want to believe that someone could do something so horrific to their own grandmother. After all, Barbara hadn't just been killed, she'd been brutalized. But regardless of what he wanted to believe, and even though Barbie had cooperated, Myers still had to consider her a major suspect at this point. She had tried to inject herself into the police investigation, she had a clear financial motive, and she was young and physically capable enough to have easily overpowered her grandmother. While Detective Myers continued to focus on Barbara's friends and family, Agent White and state police methodically interviewed staff members and the maintenance crew from the Mount Pleasant retirement village. And they also tried to collect voluntary DNA samples from as many employees as they could. But the investigation took time. There were so many people to interview just at Mount Pleasant alone that it became clear this case would not be solved overnight. And as the weeks passed by and still they had not caught the killer, Myers and White started to realize their investigation was causing a full-on panic in the retirement community. Homicide cases were almost unheard of in Monroe, so Barbara's murder had already shocked everyone in town. But now, the people who lived at Mount Pleasant started to believe there was a killer on the loose who was specifically targeting senior citizens. And they feared that the police weren't any closer to finding this killer than they had been on day one of the investigation. As the Mount Pleasant residents made their feelings public, the pressure on the police and the company that oversaw operations at Mount Pleasant continued to mount. In order to demonstrate that they were doing everything they could to protect their residents, the company that ran the retirement village helped set up a tip line with the Monroe police, and even offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who provided information that led to an arrest. On December 7, 2012, so almost a month and a half after Barbara's murder, an officer ran into Myers' office with an excited look on his face. The officer told him there was someone on the tip line, and this guy had a bizarre story that Myers needed to hear right now. And so Myers picked up the tip line, and he heard the sound of a man who had a strong Kentucky accent. The man told Myers that he had no idea if his story would actually help the police, but something had happened over a month ago that he just couldn't shake. The man said that he lived in a small Kentucky town about 150 miles away from Monroe. And not long after Barbara Howe's murder, his brother, a man named Danny French, had come to see him. And Danny had acted really strange, almost like he was saying goodbye for the last time. Now, this conversation with his brother had been disturbing enough on its own, but it was not why this man had called the tip line. The reason he had called the tip line was there was something else about his brother that was off when he had come to say this goodbye. The man said his brother had been wearing a Mount Pleasant Retirement Village sweatshirt. Detective Myers asked the man where his brother was, because he wanted to speak to Danny right away. But the man said this is actually where things got even weirder, because soon after their conversation, his brother Danny had disappeared. Immediately following this call, Myers met with Agent White, and they reached out to local police in the Kentucky town where the caller lived. But after weeks of searching, the police couldn't find the man's missing brother, Danny French. But then, on January 18, 2013, so 2.5 months after the murder, Detective Myers got a call from the cops in Kentucky. They said they had found Danny French, and apparently he'd been living in the woods for months. Myers got in his car and sped across the state line into Kentucky to the local police station where the cops had brought Danny. Danny was big and very intimidating looking. He had long gray hair and a huge gray beard, and he certainly looked and smelled like he'd been living outdoors for months. But it wasn't really Danny's appearance that shook Myers the most. Instead, it would be what Danny talked about. When Myers asked him about Barbara Howe, Danny said he didn't know her and had nothing to do with the murder. But when Myers asked him why he'd gone to live in the woods, Danny got this glazed look in his eyes, and he started talking about how the woods were a fantasy world and a place where people transformed into different things. Myers and Danny continued talking, and basically the conversation went in all sorts of different directions, into bizarre things that at times Myers just did not understand at all. It sort of seemed like Danny was sort of unhinged. But by the end of their discussion, despite the bizarreness of what they were talking about, it was clear Danny had to know something about what happened to Barbara. Myers just knew it. So when Myers left the station, he got assurances from the local police that they would keep close tabs on Danny. Still, as strange as all this might be, there was nothing actually tying Danny directly to Barbara's murder. So Myers returned to Ohio with another potential suspect, but no evidence. This had also been the case with Barbara's granddaughter Barbie and several of the Mount Pleasant employees who Agent White had interviewed. All good suspects, but no evidence. Investigators also received DNA test results of samples taken from multiple suspects and attempted to try to match them to samples found at the crime scene. Now, these results did eliminate some suspects, but they did not conclusively point to a killer. And soon, with no new evidence coming in, the investigation started to grind to a halt. Months passed, then a year went by with very few new leads. Myers and White still believed they had a few strong suspects here, but the evidence just wasn't strong enough to make any arrests. And so Barbara's case basically went cold. Fast forward to October of 2014, 2 years after Barbara's murder. Detective Myers sat in his office at the Monroe Police Station working on a different case. Now, he'd not given up on finding Barbara's killer, and both he and Agent White had continued to follow any potential leads. But Myers still worked for a small department, and so other cases did need his attention. Just then, Myers heard someone yelling his name, and then he looked up to see an officer rushing into the office with a grin on his face, and he handed Myers a piece of paper. Myers looked at the paper and saw a bunch of dates, times, and some handwritten notes, and then he asked the officer, what is this? Why are you so excited about this? And the officer said a lead in the Barbara Howe case that Myers had asked him to pursue had paid off. And this sheet of paper was a copy of the schedule that Barbara's cleaning woman had kept. Myers looked down at the schedule, and now that he knew what it was, his eyes suddenly went wide. He told the officer to find this cleaning woman and bring her in right away. He would have to ask her some questions, but Myers was now positive that this schedule finally made it clear who killed Barbara. Based on information from Barbara's cleaning woman, DNA test results, and evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara on the night of October 28th and the early morning of October 29th, 2012. The killer sat inside of their parked car, staring out at the homes that lined the quiet streets of the Mount Pleasant retirement village. The killer glanced at the clock. They knew Barbara was expecting them any minute, so it was time to move. They grabbed a stun gun sitting on the passenger seat and then stepped outside. The killer held the stun gun behind their back as they approached Barbara's house and then knocked on the door. Barbara opened the door, and the killer smiled and followed her inside. Barbara walked through the house towards her bedroom, and the killer stayed right behind her. And at some point, they raised the stun gun, pressed it to her back, and pulled the trigger. Barbara immediately felt an electric shock. She screamed, she convulsed, and fell to the floor. But to the killer's complete surprise, Barbara remained conscious, and she was trying to get back onto her feet. So the killer leapt on top of Barbara and hit her in the head, and then strangled her. Eventually, Barbara passed out. The killer stood up and picked up Barbara off the floor. She didn't weigh very much. The killer then carried her through the house into the utility room near the kitchen. They laid her on the floor, reached down, and pulled up the wood panel that hid the crawl space. Once it was open, the killer picked up Barbara and dropped her into the crawl space. And then they just stood there for a minute, thinking. After a little while, the killer simply walked out of the house, leaving the door unlocked behind them. They got in their car, drove off, and parked on a nearby street, where they could still see the Mount Pleasant retirement village. And the killer just sat there in their car and waited. Hours later, after midnight, the killer saw that almost all the lights in the retirement village had now gone off. It seemed like most residents were now asleep. So, the killer grabbed a long, sharp knife they had left on their floorboard, stepped out of their car, and quickly walked back to Barbara's house. The killer walked inside and went right to the crawl space. They looked in, and Barbara still lay there. She was unconscious, but breathing. The killer got on the floor, leaned down into the crawl space, grabbed Barbara by the hair, and slit her throat. Blood splashed onto the walls of the crawl space, but the killer didn't stop. They kept slicing and cutting Barbara's neck until they had almost decapitated her. Finally, the killer relented and stood up. They grabbed a small rug from the kitchen and slid it into the utility room. They reached down, lifted Barbara out of the crawl space, and dropped her lifeless body onto the rug. But as they did that, they realized that drool from their mouths had dripped and fallen into Barbara's hair. So they took the bloody knife and cut off that chunk of her hair. Then, for the next several minutes, the killer remained in the utility room with the body, living out their wildest and most grotesque fantasies. But at some point the killer panicked, as if they had just realized they might be leaving traces of their own DNA on Barbara's body. So they ran to the cabinet under the kitchen sink and grabbed a bottle of bleach. Then they ran back to the rug, took off Barbara's clothes, and poured the bleach all over her. Then they grabbed a vacuum cleaner that was in the utility room, opened up the bin, and dumped the dust onto Barbara's body. Finally, the killer grabbed Barbara's keys from the kitchen counter, rolled her up in the rug, and then carried her outside. In the darkness, the killer used the keys to pop open the trunk of Barbara's Cadillac. They dumped her body inside the trunk, but kept the rug. They slammed the trunk door, not noticing part of Barbara's hair was sticking out and that the trunk did not close all the way. The killer ran back into the house, threw the bloody rug into the crawl space, and covered the space up with the wood panel. Then they ran back outside, locking the door behind them, got into Barbara's car, and drove to an apartment complex in a nearby town. Once there, they abandoned the car and walked down a dark street to a large store that was open all night. From there, they called a cab, got a ride back to a spot that was not far from where they had left their own car. They walked back to their car, got in, and then sped across the state line into Kentucky. Danny French, the huge guy with the big gray beard who lived in the woods at one point and had that totally bizarre conversation with Detective Myers, murdered Barbara Howe. It would turn out Danny had once been a maintenance worker at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village, so he knew all about that crawl space. He also knew that every resident had one of those Lifeline medical emergency devices. So, on the night of the murder, he called 3 women at Mount Pleasant, posing as someone who was there to fix their Lifeline devices. And Barbara was the only one who said he could come by that night to fix it. And as soon as Barbara opened up her door and let Danny into her home, he carried out his plan. From the moment Detective Myers met Danny after he'd been pulled out of the woods for his interview, he had suspected Danny was the killer. Danny told Myers the woods were his fantasy world. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear to Myers that, in reality, Danny just had a lot of fantasies, and some of them were very dark and violent. After multiple meetings over several months, Myers convinced Danny to provide a DNA sample, and it would turn out Danny's DNA matched samples found inside of Barbara's house. But there was a problem. Danny had been a maintenance worker, so he'd been in that house many times, which could explain why his DNA was there. It was not until police got in touch with Barbara's cleaning woman that they realized there was no way Danny's DNA should still be in her house, because Barbara's cleaning woman kept a detailed schedule. It had dates and times, and she liked to list all of the work she had done on those dates and times. And so police knew that Barbara's house had been cleaned thoroughly many times since Danny had stopped working at Mount Pleasant, which meant if his DNA was there now, he must have murdered Barbara. In addition to that, police found security camera footage at that store where Danny had called the cab on the night of the murder, and the cab driver was able to identify him. Danny was arrested, and he would eventually confess. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to